All right, welcome everybody. So awesome of you to join us today. Happy Wednesday, happy April. I cannot believe it's April already. This year has been just flying by. Welcome everyone. While we're still letting folks in, please make sure to let us know where you're joining in from. I'm currently in Prague, so coming in from the heart of Europe. I love that we have such an international global community. So it's always awesome to hear where's everybody coming from. So do let us know, and we'll give it a couple more seconds for folks to join. All right, very cool. We're gonna get started here, so we don't leave you all hanging, and we can start with introducing our speakers. Before we do that, again, welcome everyone. Very awesome to be here. My name is Clara. I'm one of the co-founders here at Talkbase, host of the webinar. Super excited to be with you all. I've been an operator and a community builder for most of my life before becoming a founder, but it's always amazing to kind of go back to hosting events, talking to other community folks. It's like literally my favorite thing to do. And welcome, Jamie, and welcome, Kyle. We really appreciate you joining us today. Jamie, would you care to give us a quick introduction about you and your work?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Langscove. I have also been building community forever, even before they called it community building. I started out as a knowledge management intern. So my journey has followed its own path, but mostly I'm focused on developer communities and building product communities for tech companies. So most recently, I started my own consultancy. So I am working with a lot of startups, early and mid-stage startups, doing product-led community building for them.
Nice, super exciting. Thank you so much for joining us. And Kyle, over to you. Can you give us a quick intro as well about you and your community work?
You bet. I was not a knowledge management intern, although now that sounds badass. I kind of want to be. What's up, everyone? Kyle Hagee. I'm director of community at Morning Brew. Super pumped to be here. Thanks for tuning in. And special shout out to my people with their cameras on, because I do like to see faces. If you can't turn your camera on, it's all good. We don't know what's going on. Like I said, I'm director of community at Morning Brew. I've been at the company for 2 years. If you're not familiar with Morning Brew, it started as a daily newsletter that kind of summarizes what's going on in the world, mainly focused on business. I think we have about 4.25 million subscribers. Now we have a suite of newsletters, but I was brought on 2 years ago to build the first paid product at Morning Brew, which turned out to be cohort-based courses. We've grown from that single product 2 years ago now to a suite of product, anywhere from 1 week courses to 8 week courses, everything in between. And then we, build community inside of those courses. And then what's really cool is we also have an awesome alumni community of folks that have graduated from those courses. We now have over 2,400 alumni. So very exciting. Prior to Morning Brew, I did some stuff with podcasting from Marquette University. I worked for the Housing Authority from the city of Milwaukee. I did 2 years of AmeriCorps. So I was teaching in high schools. And so I think there's kind of a community thread through all of that. And yeah, very excited to be here.
Wow, amazing. Thank you both so much for the introduction. It's a really exciting day today because we've been talking about doing this topic of talking about our mistakes, about the failures we had in community, and kind of the topic has been on my mind for quite some time, but actually our online coffee with Kyle kind of pushed us to finally dive into it, because we were talking about we always wish that others would share their learnings and their mistakes, just so that we know that we're not alone in stepping in the right direction sometimes. So that's exactly what we're going to do here today. Today's conversation is going to be recorded, so in case you have to run early and don't want to miss it or want to watch it again, we're going to have the recording for you. And in our community, we always do a little recap. So if you want to learn kind of through the written version, you will see it in our community in the channel events. If you're not a member, just ping me. I'm happy to share with you the access to our community of other community builders. All right, let's dive right in. When I say making a mistake, Jamie, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
I was thinking about this again this morning, and I think blame often comes to mind. And I think that in itself is a mistake, but I think it's something that we all kind of think of, when you hear mistake, you think, okay, whose mistake, whose fault was it? And so I suspect we're going to explore that a little bit today as well.
100%. Kyle, how about you? When I say making a mistake, what comes to mind?
Well, first I'll say it's great to be able to up here and talk about all the times you fucked up. It's just, that's nothing gets me more excited. I think Jamie's answer around blame is really spot on. I think for me, a lot of it is just kind of, when I think of it, it's like, it is an opportunity to learn. I do think that people often say like, oh, just learn from your mistakes. Or like, we've kind of celebrated mistakes as like learning opportunities, which I think is great. But I do think that you actually have to reflect on the mistake you've made in order to not make it again. And I do think often that piece is missing. So I would go like reflection. When I hear mistake, it is an opportunity to reflect. It is an opportunity to learn. Although if you do not reflect, you're not just going to learn automatically from your mistakes, and you're probably going to keep making them. So I love blame, and then I'll throw in reflection as well.
I love that, Kyle. I'll say that if it's okay, I'll jump in and respond.
Yeah, please do.
Firstly, I see you all the time, and in terms of like on my feed and everything, and I'm like, that morning brew sounds really cool. Is it just like a podcast? So I love the opportunity to learn more. I actually pulled up your homepage while you were explaining it as well. So anyway, it's really cool to be here with you. And I love the reflection piece. It's something that one of the things that I do in my spare time is mentor and work with my kids' scout troop. And they're a very young troop in terms of the troop itself has not been around very long. And so they're going through this process of like, okay, we tried a thing. It was really awful. What can we learn from that? So I love that you brought up that element of reflection, because I think you're right. It has to be a conscious process to actually be able to learn from it.
100%. And something I think, when we talk about that conscious process, something I would recommend to everyone is to do postmortems. And I think, it's quite interesting. I think this has been a huge unlock in my career, and we run postmortems for every single cohort that we run after, like what went right and what went wrong, and what are we actually learning and internalizing from those experiences. So if you're not doing postmortems with your team, I totally recommend it. Like, institutionalize that reflection piece. And I think that if you can't articulate why something is successful, or if you can't articulate why something wasn't, then you're just getting lucky. You might be getting lucky and it works out. You might be getting lucky or unlucky and it didn't work out. But being able to articulate that, the why did something work out? Why did something not work out? Then you're not going to make the same mistake again, or you've developed a repeatable process that you feel confident will lead to more successes in the future. So highly recommend postmortems.
You might be my new best friend. I think
we need to we'll have to hang out after this. Yeah.
We're going to write a blog post, y'all. We're going to get together. We're going to write a blog post about doing postmortems for community programs, because
love it.
That is something that coming out of IT early on and, product support and things like that, you talk a lot about root cause analysis, but you don't see that perpetuate very well across the rest of the business. And it really should. And I think that's an opportunity for us as a profession to lead that movement. We're already trying to connect people in technology. Let's throw a process in there and teach the industry how to do it right.
100%. And I think by incorporating that process of postmortem as a team, as a company, you're just like leaving the space for actually like being able to like voice your mistakes, right? Often when you make a mistake, I think the culture in a lot of teams is like, oh, hide it, don't tell anyone. Like this is the worst thing that could happen, right? And especially in community, like you're public, you're out there, all your members can see you, right? So if you're able to actually like reflect and say it out loud, I think it like takes that like level of like fear so much, it can make it so much lower, right? And I think one of the things that I immediately thought of was when you say, you know, making a mistake is guilt. I thought of guilt, like, uh-oh, like, you know, something wrong happened. So I love that we kind of went full circle from, you know, what we feel to, you know, how we can reflect to what we should implement, and all the way to a blog post, which I would love to read from both of you. So super excited.
I really love this conversation already, which is great. And I know we have more questions, but this is such an interesting thread to pull on, I think, is going back to the point you just made, and Jamie's point about blame. Like, I think it's really important if you're leading a team to reduce the hesitancy to share a mistake, because I think if you don't have like psychological safety with your team and people feel like I can't share when I've made a mistake, you're actually kind of like fucking yourself in the future, because the mistake is probably a result of a process or a way of the team thinking that just isn't actually rooted in reality. And a mistake is made. And if they don't share that, like someone else on your team is going to make it again, or you're going to make it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have a culture of like, everything, we made a mistake, like even if you hit send or you did that, like it's the team's responsibility. And so sharing that is actually helping the team. I think it's really important, or everyone's just making the same mistake over and over again in silos, which is never good.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. We need more than an hour, y'all. So I love that you address the leadership component, because that's what I was thinking about when Clara, you were making your point as well, was it. And I would take it a step further, Kyle. I would say as a leader, as a manager, it is your responsibility to say the team wins. And when we make a mistake, I made a mistake, because it's bigger, like you said, it's bigger than the team. It's process. There's some sort of checks and balance that isn't in place to prevent this from happening. And we see it a lot on the development side. Like if somebody takes down production, for those not in the tech space, but if you break your production instance because you made a silly development mistake, there's a process broken there that should have prevented you from being able to make that mistake without having lots of like, are you sure? You maybe want to test that a little bit. Here's an error, you know, like there are flags that we can put in place that will help people avoid making those mistakes. And I think, you know, it goes, my education background is in political science. It goes to the core of who people are. And fundamentally, I believe that people want to do the right thing. They want to be good at their jobs. They want to be successful. And if they're making mistakes, you as a manager are not setting them up for that success, or you're not helping them stay on.
100%. And I don't think it's even like if they're making mistakes, it's when, because we all make mistakes. Like I have not met a single person that did not make a mistake. Like we do them all the time, right? And like that's why we're here, because we want to shine the light to it. So I absolutely 100% agree. Yeah.
When you reached out to us, and I'm sure for Kyle it was the same. It wasn't like, have you ever made a mistake? Would you be interested in talking about it? It was like, hey, do you want to come do this conversation about the mistakes we've made? Because you're right, it's across the board.
100%. Well, speaking of the mistakes we made, let's talk about them. Let's share them. Let's see what we learned. So my first question, Kyle, to you. Tell us about a time you made your biggest mistake as a community builder. How did you deal with it? What happened? Walk us through it.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I actually thought of three kind of like maybe smaller examples, but I think they're relatively big and probably pretty common. So the first I would say is ensuring that your programming, we run, cohort based courses and do alumni events, ensuring that your programming actually looks like the community that you want to build. I think it's very easy to lean on your own networks for finding speakers, finding content experts, finding X, Y, or Z. And so for me, like, my network tends to, as people do, look like myself. And not that that's, a bad thing, but when you're building a community, like, you don't want that. And so you have to be really intentional and really thoughtful about how you're sourcing guests, how you're securing guests, compensation for guests, all of that stuff to make sure that the community you want to build is reflected in the people you're bringing in for some of these speaker roles. And I think we've made that mistake, often. Just it's one of those things that if you're not very intentional about it, the default is going to be a mistake. So that's something that we, work on a lot. And I think, again, transparency and having those conversations is key, and having a process of like, this is when we need to book guests by. These are the guests we're going to ask. Here's our backup guests if they cannot. Very important. The second thing I think that is very common for people in community, but I think probably relevant for everyone that considers themselves or wants to be a leader, is understanding the context around you. Community is such a public facing role, and you're dealing with people who are going through the range of human emotions. And like, I think oftentimes community gets this reputation as being like super bubbly and like, oh, you got to be happy all the time. Like, that isn't really how people are. And like, breaking news, like, there's wars and shit. Like, there's like bad stuff that happens. And I think if you're not tuned into that, you can come off as very tone deaf. You can come off as like, okay, like, your little thing is not the most important thing right now. Like, there's this other thing happening in the world, and maybe giving space for that would have been the better option. I think, we've made that mistake often because it does, again, like, you have to be very intentional. You have to be tuned into what's going on around you. I think the fix there is like, acknowledging that a mistake was made and saying like, this is why, like, this is how it happened. And then talking to your team about just like, how are we going to prevent that again? And I think oftentimes it's just getting eyes on things. And then the last thing I'll say is not setting expectations. I think that clarity is kindness. When you're doing any community events and you're bringing people together, we have this idea of how we want them to act as a group. And sometimes we don't articulate that out loud. And then we're like, oh, people didn't act how I wanted them to. And you're like mad at them. It's like, no, that is your fault. Like, if you do not set expectations, people will do their defaults, and it's unlikely that their defaults map perfectly to what you want. So being very clear about expectations, reiterating those expectations, kind of creating rituals around that is very important. And so those are, I think, 3 buckets that I've made plenty of mistakes in.
Wow, I love that. And especially the last one on creating expectations rings so true to me. And I feel like to a lot of us, I have a very operational mind. So I always build everything in my brain, but then I speak like 1% of it. And I feel like a lot of community managers like have this perfect vision of the perfect community, but then like we forget to like translate it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it again, and why we're doing this, and these are our values and this is our purpose. I think that's so true. So I 100% agree with you, and thank you for sharing all those 3. Jamie, any thoughts from your end before we dive into your biggest mistake as a community builder?
Well, my thoughts are, yep. we I think have all stumbled over those pitfalls before. I will say that especially the last one on clarity resonates with me really strongly. I promised my LinkedIn people that I would talk a little bit about neurodiversity in this call as well. And I will say that one of the things that's been hardest for me to learn along the lines of clarity is, and setting expectations, is what do I assume other people understand, and making sure that we are actually all aligned, instead of me thinking, well, this is intuitive. Why? I don't understand. Why am I running up against resistance? And, one of the things that I really struggled with at SAP was it's such a huge organization, and you have so many stakeholders. There's over 3 million daily active users in there, and it's across over like 150 products. So you can imagine, just from a logistical perspective, how hard it would be to kind of rally all your stakeholders and get everybody on board with everything. And so part of it is, balancing, okay, what are we putting out versus what are we preparing to deal with in the aftermath? But I will say that nearly every big challenge that I have come across as a community manager is making sure that my stakeholders are actually aligned and on board with what we're doing. And I have one specific example of this that was really frustrating and very hard to navigate because I didn't fully understand it. In one of my companies, I had ownership over all of the community events, and we had a separate marketing events team. And the marketing events manager and I got along fine as people, but for some reason, I was continually getting this very negative feedback through back channels of like, they're mad at us, they don't like what we're doing, they're really upset about something. And ultimately, it took months of like escalating to VPs, and we couldn't get on the same page, and it was wild. And what I finally learned was she thought I was trying to take her job. And I was like, girl, I do not want to run your conference, okay? Like, you do you. My only purpose in your conference is to deal with the developer activities there and like trying to bring that particular audience to help boost your conference. Like, I'm here to help you. And once we sorted that out, everything was fine. And it was wild how much drama resulted from not just addressing these assumptions and, miscommunications and misconceptions that people have especially about the work we do, because it can be very vague. So that's one of my biggest ones, I would say, that created the most strife in my day-to-day life. The other one I wanted to bring up, though, was more around circumstances and adapting to when things change outside of your control. And so that's kind of why I went to blame in the beginning, because sometimes it's an entirely blameless situation. So at Mongo, for those who are unaware, I led the development of the developer community at MongoDB, which is a database company that is pretty dominant in that space. And when I first started, my new boss, who just joined the organization as well, had gotten approval for us to do a speaker grant. So basically providing travel and expense, coaching, speaker coaching, things like that for people who wanted to, from the developer community, go speak at other events about MongoDB. And immediately after we launched the program, the pandemic hit. And suddenly we had this money set aside and this program we had built out, and nobody was traveling. Events were getting canceled left and right. And so part of what I did in response to that was, okay, we can't give you travel and expense. Like, there's no reason to, but we can still do the coaching, and we can give you an opportunity to speak at our events, and we can help you, for those that are switching to virtual events, submit your proposals, prepare for those, review your deck, things like that. So part of it is recognizing when there are circumstances outside of your control that make whatever you had committed to no longer viable or productive. And, figuring out, okay, where do we go from here? So Kyle, like you were saying in the beginning, how do you reflect on that even in the process? Like, something is not happening the way we want it to. How are we going to adapt?
Oops, sorry. Little mistake, forgetting to unmute the usual one. But I was gonna say, I love that. I think that it can happen often in community that circumstances change, right? Whether it's the types of personas you're building the community for, right? You're changing platforms, you're changing programs, like you're constantly ever evolving. And I think part of it is in your control. And I think a big part isn't, right? Example, what your members like. Really, really very much outside of our control. So I think adapting is super important. And I also loved what you said, Jamie, on kind of the miscommunication. There's actually a study that shows that we miss each other as humans on the first point of contact and transferring information 70% of the time. And where relationships are built and things are clarified in the reconnection, that's where most of our communication happens. So it's actually, you know, from setting expectations to resetting them to making sure everybody understands and your team is aligned over and over and over again. I think that's so important. And yeah, I think it can be, like I said again, very tempting to kind of work on things on the back end, work on things on your own and not sharing them publicly. But then again, you're missing, right? You're missing the community, you can miscommunicate, etc. So 100%. Very cool.
Just to add something to what Jamie was saying at the end, I think when situations change, like there's the quote where it's not the crime, it's the cover up that like always does you in. And I think it's like a perfect example. People can just tell when you're like bullshitting them. And I think that most people like totally understand that things happen that are outside of your control. And the stress you feel about telling someone something that's like changed is actually way worse than when you actually have the conversation with them. They're like, oh, thanks for laying it out. Maybe they're not happy, but they're like, I understand where you're coming from and we can move on. And so you do so much like internal damage and bring so much stress upon yourself worrying about this, or like, oh, we just like, what if we just don't tell people? It just be straight with people. And that often is the best option pretty much every time.
Very true.
That is the constant struggle, especially with product managers, you know, getting them to recognize like the community is not stupid. They're going to figure out that you have not delivered the thing that they've been asking for, right? And if you communicate with them like, hey, we ended up having this other stuff we had to prioritize in the meantime, like bug fixes and things like that, especially in developer communities, they get that. They understand. And if we empathize and treat them like colleagues instead of like, I don't know, scary mobs, we tend to get a better bond. I think that when you're vulnerable with people, that gives your organization and you a more human connection to your community. So I agree 100%. Kyle.
100%. I think this is like, honestly, all the lessons for community, it's like any job. They're also just lessons in leadership. It's like, if you're vulnerable, you invite other people to be vulnerable themselves. And it is leading by example. And if you admit to mistakes, then other people are more likely to admit to mistakes. And you create a community that is okay when things don't go 100% as planned. And I think that is a beautiful thing for communities or for teams.
Absolutely. 100% agree. Continuing with kind of, you know, working with teams, you know, leading with by example and leading with kindness and vulnerability. Kyle, how did you deal when somebody on your team made a mistake, right? From the other side, not you, not your learnings, but somebody on your team who made a mistake. What was your framework? What was your approach to it?
Yeah, great question. And I want to, you know, shout out Jamie. I think that when you focus on like the who made the mistake, it's probably just not the best way to build a team. And I think if you're a team, it's either like, okay, I think there's two philosophies. It's either the team made a mistake in all parts of like if an individual component made a mistake, the whole thing is at fault, or that you as the leader, you made the mistake. You didn't set up a process, you didn't inform, you didn't. Now, so I agree with those for the most part. I do think that accountability is really important too, though. And again, it is about like changing the definition of a mistake. Like, you made a mistake, that doesn't mean like you're a person that often makes mistakes. It's nothing personal. It is just a fact. Like, we wanted to do this and you did that. That's a mistake. And so one, I think calling it out and being clear that like, this isn't what we wanted. Two, I think that you should give feedback as close to the action as possible. There's nothing worse than when someone's like, hey, I just want to bring this up. A month ago, I saw you do this and here's some feedback on that. It's like, okay, like you should deliver feedback pretty much instantaneously if you can, or even ask them like, hey, I want to give you some feedback on what just happened. Are you comfortable with me sharing that now? Or do you want to give it some time to process and we could have this conversation tomorrow? But giving feedback close to the action as possible. Again, clarity is kindness. I think feedback is a gift, both for the person receiving it and the person giving it, and it enables trust. So yeah, I think if the team makes a mistake, hopefully you've created a culture in which that's okay, that you can have some accountability, you can have conversations around it. And I think at the end of that, like, how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again? And put in a new process. And again, it goes back to doing postmortems and understanding why a mistake was made. Honestly, if you're going to give feedback and you're not going to do a postmortem, you might as well not even give feedback. Hey, you did this wrong. I have no idea why. I'm not going to try to fix it. We're not going to put any new process in place. What's the point? So if you're going to give feedback, make sure you have some follow-up, some new process to ensure it doesn't happen again.
Yes, 100%. I absolutely agree with you, especially on following up and making sure that you make it actionable. And we have in the chat a message that some of your team members are here with us, keeping us accountable on on how we deal with mistakes.
They'll tell you if I'm bullshitting you all or not.
Love it, love it, wonderful. Jamie, what are your thoughts on how to work with your team when they're making mistakes? You know, how to lead the team in a way that they feel comfortable sharing them, even bringing them up. I think that's still like the biggest roadblock. Yeah, what have you done in the past?
Yeah, I think there's this is sort of a thing that you have to approach from lots of different angles. And what I mean by that is, one, you don't ever let it get to the point that your performance review is a surprise. So if you have a community member who is struggling, like Kyle said, you should be addressing that sooner than later and helping to guide them on that growth journey, because that's obviously an area of growth for them. So if there's somebody who is struggling, or they're making mistakes repeatedly, or they're just not getting it, again, they're not stupid. They need different kind of support. And you as the manager should be having regular conversations with them about how you can support them. I have had direct reports before that ended up getting let go, and it was because we could not find a path forward such that that person was invested in their own success. But I think if you're both coming to the table and you are there to help them succeed, they'll know that. People are intuitive. They understand, you're here for my success, or you're here to, hold the whip behind my back. It's one or the other. Like, are you supporting me and trying to get me caught up with the team, or are you trying to leave me behind for the Coyotes, right? So I think that that's one thing, is just regularly communicating, checking in, getting updates. So like, don't let it go too long before you check in with your team members. Make sure that things are going well. If you have questions, asking those along the way instead of waiting for them to bring it up. Like, I feel like a lot of managers, they play these games with their team members where they're like, well, I'm waiting to see if they come up with this. I'm waiting to see if they give me the right answer or they ask the right question. Like, that's fine to an extent. Like, if you have done the work to prepare them and then you're kind of checking in later, that's fine. But if you are just setting them up to fail, you're both going to end up upset. So I think when it comes to individuals, it's very important for you to be invested in them along the way, instead of, I hired you to do a job. Why can't you do the job? Well, maybe I don't know why I can't do the job. I thought I could do the job. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities there for coaching and mentoring. I really love bringing on and mentoring junior people because it's really exciting to see them achieve and grow. So I think that's one thing. Another thing that Kyle brought up is, how do we talk about it then as a team? I've been on teams where the managers pretend that somebody who quit never existed. Like, we don't acknowledge that that person was ever here. What a weird thing to experience. Like, are we all just going along with this weird ass approach to, I don't want to deal with conflict? What is happening? So I think that in that sense, even on, operational mistakes and things like that happened, something didn't go the way we wanted it to. I think if it was an individual who was primarily working on that thing and, responsibility wise, accountability wise, I would work with them directly first. And then together we would come up with, okay, what is the root cause of this? How do we prevent it from happening again? Now let's go back to the team and we'll share our plan, and you will share the plan. It's not going to be reprimanding you in front of the team. It's not going to be calling out, well, this thing happened, we can't let that happen again. You know, you're going to come to the team, you're going to say, hey, I was running this, some bad stuff happened, mistakes were made, here's the lessons learned, here's the process going forward that's going to be different. And I think that empowers them to feel that psychological safety.
Absolutely, 100% guiding them through the process. I love that. Everything you shared, Jamie, that was spot on. 100%. Kyle, any thoughts on your end?
Yeah, I'll add a few things and like maybe try to make this like just tactical advice for people in careers. I think the first thing, and I think Jamie talked about this, is honestly, I think if you're someone who makes a mistake in private, like individually, and you then figure out why the mistake was made and you figure out a process to not make it again, and you share that, it seems kind of counterintuitive. Like, why would I share that I made a mistake with the team? I have them, like, those are the people I 100% want to work with. Those, like, one, they're aware they made a mistake. I've worked with tons of people, like, they just do, like, they don't even know it was a mistake. So you know it was a mistake, which means you know what the right thing was to do. You found a solution, you documented that solution, you communicated it effectively, and now everyone learns from it. Like, okay, you're the best. Like, that's a pro tip for anyone. Like, if you make a mistake in private, make it public. It seems weird, but I think it's actually very effective. And if you're a great manager, you're going to reward that person. I think the second thing too is kind of like the elephant in the room, or I don't know if that's the correct metaphor, but like there is a power dynamic when it comes to feedback. And that is like, if you are someone's manager, like we like to say it, you know, we have a flat organization, all that, but like people know what the hierarchy is. And that hierarchy still gives you more power inside any organization. And I think it's really important for managers to be aware of that. I think the hardest thing to do is to get your direct reports to give you feedback. And if you're just expecting them to, like, naturally, I think that's really hard. I know I felt that in my career. Like, do I really want to give my boss feedback? Like, it's a tough situation. And so having, as a manager, some go-to phrases that you can use to like solicit feedback is very, very important just to set that culture. We have Kat Cole speak in some of our courses, who's the COO of Athletic Greens. And she says one thing, she talks to kind of people that report to her, she'll ask them, if you were in my shoes, what's one thing you would do differently to move the business forward? And she talks about how, one, this is very empowering to someone to be like, okay, my boss can imagine me doing their role. Two, they're asking, give me a thing that you would be doing differently than I am. So it's like you're getting feedback on maybe what you should be doing. And then also it's centering the outcome that would move the business forward. This isn't about a personal thing. It isn't, we're not talking about personal feedback. We're talking about feedback that helps us achieve the mission we're here to achieve together more effectively. So having phrases like that as a manager, I think, are very important.
100%. I love that. I think this is a great, not just a great session on learning, kind of like what mistakes are and that we all make them, but also how to deal with them on like not just an individual level, but a leadership level, a team level. So thank you both so much for sharing all your wisdom. I think it's absolutely brilliant. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Before we get to them, we also collected a bunch of questions during registrations. So I would love to bring up the first one because I want to be mindful of our time. And this question is coming from Adam. Kyle, what was your biggest tail between the legs moment when you that you run into while building communities?
It's a great question, and I think it goes back to kind of, if I'm interpreting this correctly, like some of the biggest mistakes we've made. So maybe I'll give another answer, which is when I was first at Morning Brew, I was building like the kind of, we have like an orientation deck. I was building this, and I had to present it to pretty much all of senior leadership at the time. And I made the very dumb decision to like not put eyes on this prior to the meeting. Like I was just like, I'm crushing this. This is going to be the best presentation ever. Oh my God. It was so bad. It was so bad And it's one of those things where you're 5 minutes in, you're like, this is terrible. This is really bad.
Oh, no.
I don't even know. And it's like way too many slides and you're in your own personal hell. You're like, there's only one way and it's just going through this. The next 30 minutes are going to be a low light in my life. And I literally remember like they stopped me. Like they were like, stop. Like this is like not good. Not in a way that felt like personal, just like, I think like we're missing the mark here. And like, let's go back and like put some other eyes on this. And so I think that was like the biggest like tails between my leg moment. We're like, okay, I learned 2 lessons. One, eyes on everything, professionally and personally. The second you start feeling so confident that you know 100% what's going on, no, you don't. Get a different perspective in there. Personally too. Like if you're like, maybe you're even starting to feel like, I'm kind of like feeling this way, call in a friend, bring them in early before it metastasizes to a much bigger problem. The second lesson is everyone makes mistakes. Again, I think it's how you respond. And I was like, I totally agree. I really appreciate that feedback. I went back, I made the deck kick ass. It was way better. We presented it again. It was a phenomenal presentation that second time. And to me, again, it's not about like being perfect the first time, but how do you respond to feedback? Do you actually take that feedback and implement it? And then when you get your second chance, do you kick ass? And those are the people I think everyone wants to work with, because we all know the first draft is not the best, but how do you take other people's feedback and make the second draft even better? So that's probably my biggest tail between the legs moment. And again, in a weird way, it probably engendered a lot of trust in me and my position to senior leadership about how I responded to their feedback.
100%.
I want to reflect on that just for a minute, because 2 things I picked up on that. One, your leadership gave you feedback in the moment that was productive enough for you to feel confident to go back and try again. And 2, you do not only have one shot at life, friends. Like, you mess up, all right, you strike out, you come back up at your next at bat and you get your head in the game, right? So I think those 2 things are important, and it's really easy, especially if it's your first couple times presenting to an executive audience, to feel like, oh my God, this is my one chance and I screwed it up. And now I'm just gonna go, I don't know, be a janitor or something. Like, shout out to the janitors, but you know what I mean. You will have more chances to come back.
100%. Yes. I love that. I think that's so true. And another thing I kind of heard there was also like asking for help, which I think is super important. I think that's another thing why we often like make mistakes to start with, like by thinking we can tackle everything on our own. And I am 100% there with making presentations or even like writing. I'm the worst writer in the world. 70% of my job is writing stuff, and I am the worst. I have dyslexia. I type very weird words that don't make sense, and I have to literally correct every single thing I write. And it's very, I'm not sure if, for those of you who are not members of our community, very often it happens that instead of Happy Friday, we post every Friday. I usually type like happy fry, happy friend, like random words come in. So it's always awesome to have my team right there to help me. That's something I learned. And I know that I can only save some mistakes with Grammarly, but having my team there and always asking for help where I know I need it is super important. So 100% there. All right. To be mindful of time, our next question from our registrations was, and Jamie, I'll direct this one to you. In organizations, when we make a mistake, and we say we'll never do it again, we'll give it a couple of months, and then we do the same. Due to budget constraints, lack of support, etc. Any recommendations on how to drive change in organization so that we're just not like stuck in the old ways? I love this question. What are your thoughts?
Question too. I'm so excited to answer this one. Okay, so earlier in this call, we talked a little bit about getting your stakeholders on board and finding alignment and all that. So all of my struggles with that led me to pursue a change management certification. So this is why I love this question. One of the most important things you can do when you find yourself in this position where you are making repeated mistakes across the organization is, 1, document. Root cause analysis. Here's what happened. Here's why it happened. Here's the new process. And then go and get your executives on board. Prepare things for them to then distribute to their teams, like make it as easy as possible for them to be the champions of your message. And once you do that, and a lot of people will tell you, oh, we don't have a top-down culture. And like Kyle said, that's kind of bullshit. I mean, let's be real. Everybody listens to the CEO, to an extent. But I mean, you will have to reinforce that. And what Clara said earlier as well, as far as repeating the message, is also important. And so making sure that you are setting up those systematic checks. See, we're all coming back full circle, this whole conversation. So you're setting up those systematic checks such that, if you try to do something in the system, it's going to pop up and say, hey, did you check this? Or, it won't let you move forward if you don't do a certain step. Those things can be very annoying, but they exist for that reason, to try to help you build new habits and adopt a new process. I see Jillian's asking, what about when your CEO is the issue? And I think that requires diplomacy, and it depends on the size of your organization and the culture in your organization. So I have been in that situation as well. I think that one of the most powerful things you can do is get another CEO, or not another CEO, sorry, another C-level or another executive on board with you, such that you have their voice supporting what you're trying to say, as opposed to you trying to go in. The CEO is not the be all end all necessarily when it comes to especially operational things, because a lot of times they don't have the time or interest in getting into that level. So if your CEO is truly the problem, figure out who your other allies can be and build up a coalition to support what you are trying to get changed.
I couldn't agree more with what Jamie said, and I'll add one thing that I think struggled with early in my career that I'm really conscientious of now. And I think that is, we often argue, or not argue, but like we often advocate for what we want using what motivated us to like think of that. Like, oh, we should do this. Like, isn't it obvious because X, Y, and Z? And you're using the things that convinced you, right? It's so natural. Like, why did you come up with this idea? This, that, and that. Well, that works for you. I think we often then say everyone else is going to think about or relate to the reasons that changed my mind or led me to this belief, which is not true. I think the number one thing, or the first thing you should do, is identify, how does the person I'm trying to convince think? What matters to them? And if your thing needs to be like translated in a way that then helps them achieve their goals, like then you've aligned incentives, and I think you're going to get a lot less resistance. So if you're talking to the CEO, you're talking to your boss, you're talking to someone who's a data analyst, if you're a community person, you might be like, oh my God, this post got 100 smileys. They love it. And the data analyst is like, I don't care. But if you can be like, or like the finance person's like, cool. But if you can say, hey, we sent this email and it got 100 clicks. And of those people that clicked, 5 people purchased a product, and it netted us $8,000 in revenue for one email. And this is the historical perspective of all other emails we've sent. This is a really effective email. Okay. I'm a finance person. I'm like, I like that. So figuring out exactly, speak their language, figure out the language of the people you're trying to convince, and use their language. Don't use your language. Like, that's not going to convince them. It only is going to convince you. So, and you've already been convinced. I really struggled with that early. I was like frustrated when people didn't get it. And I was like, I'm not using their language. So that's my other piece of advice.
I love that. That's so important. And I think it's so hard. Thank you both for this advice, because whenever I talk to someone who's like, I'm in a community role in a company that does not believe in community and, doesn't want to give us budget and doesn't want to support it, I'm always like, I don't know what I would do. Like, there is a lot of companies that really do believe in community and want to build it, so I do love that you both shared ideas on how people can tackle this from a strategic point, right? And really be able to kind of get over the hurdle and, make sure that they're doing their best work. I think that's amazing. All right, friends, we're very much closing on time. Before we hop, I have a last question for both of you. Which mistake are you looking forward to making? I'll give you both a quick second to think. I think one of the biggest things for me, I can kick us off here for this year, one of the big challenge is more experimentation. And I think experimentation is a fancy word for trying to make mistakes and then looking at them and then kind of going in it again. And that's what we're doing with a lot of our content, with a lot of our graphics, a lot of our events. And I'm looking forward to seeing what works, what doesn't. And you have to put it out there, unless you'd never know. So that's kind of the one mistake I'm really looking forward to. Cal, Jamie, who wants to go first?
Oh, that one's really tough. I think in the past, I've had a struggle with saying no. And I think the mistake I'm looking forward to making this year is having too much interest in things. So like hosting an event and having too many people show up, or having too many clients and having to figure out what to do with that. It is a struggle because you have to start setting boundaries and keep yourself sane, but it is one that you can at least anticipate and figure out how to adapt in that case. And I know that's like a softy answer, but I'm not really sure what else I want to put into words and put out in the universe right now.
Nice. No, I think that's amazing. I think that's a good, it's always kind of, I always say that those are the like nice problems to have, right? So, and those are also the good things, right? And it comes with a lot of work. So I think that's amazing. Cool. Cal, what about you? A mistake that you're looking forward to?
I would say I still feel like I don't want to make any mistakes. I know I will, but so I'm putting it out in the universe. I'm just letting the universe know. I don't mean this. I'm not trying to create a mistake for myself, but I think it's probably a soft answer too. I think one of the things that can be draining in the community role is like, you know, some of the best community managers, they give a lot of people access to their life and themselves, and at scale that can get really hard. And I think the mistake you don't want to make is like, you feel like you don't want to let anyone down. And I think sometimes the mistake I'm looking to make is like to let people down, but the real silver lining is like, you realize that like they're going to be okay, and like when you get back to them like 24 or 48 hours later, they're just going to be happy you got back to them. And so, yeah, I think boundaries, I mean, everything in life is boundaries, and that's something that I'm not particularly good at. So I'll make that mistake.
That's amazing. Wow. Thank you both so much for this honest conversation. I honestly enjoyed every minute of it. I'm not really sure how we're going to do our quick recap in like 3 bullet points, because this is going to be a tough one. There was so much wisdom and so much truth shared today. So Jamie, thank you. Kyle, thank you for your time. To our amazing attendees, thank you for being so active in the chat. We appreciate you. If you're not a member of our community, I just posted the link there if you wanted to join us. And yeah, we'll be sending the recording, sharing the recording with everyone. I hope you have an amazing rest of your Wednesday, and hopefully see everyone soon on our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Peace.